of the Americas University Office Hours. We are delighted to have you all here with us today to discuss the important and pressing global topic of disinformation and democracy. My name is Sage Brewer. I am a first-year MPP student at the Korbel School and also work at Korbel full-time. I am from Colorado and earned a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Colorado in Boulder. My professional career includes experience in Colorado state government, a global environmental nonprofit, and now higher education. My interests in domestic politics have grown greatly in the last 10 years, particularly with rising partisanship and polarization. Before I introduce our panelists and begin our discussion this afternoon, I want to acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous people on the land the University of Denver and broader city of Denver currently reside on. The land is held in stewardship by the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations, and we additionally recognize the descendant communities of the Northern Cheyenne of Montana, the Northern Arapaho of Wyoming, and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho of Oklahoma. These communities were forcibly removed from their native lands, and we also acknowledge the Southern Ute and Mountain Ute nations here in Colorado. We wish to recognize their presence and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. Today, we begin with the 5th session of our educational conversation series, City Summit of the Americas, University Office Hours. This series has featured some compelling exchanges amongst panelists from government, civil society, and academia, and recordings of all of our previous sessions are now available on the City Summit of the Americas website. So to start, what is the City Summit of the Americas? Later this month, the U.S. Department of State and the City of Denver, Colorado will host city and community leaders from across the Americas at the inaugural City Summit, convening representatives of government, civil society, business, culture and the arts, and more. The City Summit will promote regional cooperation of cities and states of all sizes across the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, the U.S. Department of State and City of Denver will host the City Summit of the Americas for Youth. This government policy and innovation summit will bring together young professionals from around the Western Hemisphere to participate in interactive panels and workshops on topics ranging from climate change, entrepreneurship, and more. The Youth Summit application is open, and we encourage all qualifying young people to take advantage of this opportunity and spark critical conversations to take action on the most pressing hemispheric issues. More information about the City Summit and the City Summit for Youth can be found on citysummitoftheamericas.org. Today, we begin the 5th conversation in the City Summit Office Hours series, Disinformation and Democracy. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, beginning with Emily Bruchon. Emily is a career U.S. diplomat, currently serving as Senior Advisor for Countering Disinformation at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. She has served in the State Department as a Foreign Service Officer for more than 15 years, with international postings including Paris, Bangkok, and Oslo. Emily has additionally held positions in Washington, D.C. on issues related to the Balkans and global public diplomacy. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Sage. Happy to be here.
Emily is joined by Dr. Nazneen Barma. Naz Barma is the founding director of the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy, Scrivener Chair of Public Policy, and Associate Professor at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She is a political scientist whose widely published work spans topics including peace building, foreign aid, and global governance, with a regional focus on Asia. Dr. Barma is also one of the founders and co-directors of Bridging the Gap, an initiative devoted to enhancing the policy impact of contemporary international affairs scholarship. Welcome, Naz.
Thank you all. Great to be here with you.
And to complete our panel this afternoon, we have Roberta Braga joining us. Roberta is the director of Counter Disinformation Strategies at the Akis Institute, where she oversees work on monitoring and countering disinformation and misinformation targeted at and about Latinos in the United States. She previously served as Global Content and Campaigns Manager at the global law firm Baker McKenzie, and as Deputy Director for Programs and Outreach at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsh Latin America Center. Originally from Brazil, Roberta earned her master's degree in global communication with a focus on public diplomacy from George Washington University, and her bachelor's degree in journalism and international security from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a Penn Kemble Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and a cyber fellow with Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. We are so excited to have you all here with us today. Welcome, Roberta.
Thank you, Sage.
We will now begin with the discussion portion of our time today. For those of you who in the audience who have questions for our three fantastic panelists, please be sure to submit your questions in the chat. I'll start by asking student speaker Fatima Zora to join our discussion. Fatima is a J. Williams Fulbright Fellow pursuing a master's degree in public policy with a specialization in human rights and security at the Corbell School. Fatima additionally holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. Fatima?
Hi, everyone. So my question is about disinformation and democracy, its impact. So disinformation can advance social division and increase intolerance toward a certain group or specific type of policy making. So what can we do to avoid the influence of disinformation? Can we think about any state or national level program that promotes tolerance and inclusion?
I'll take a stab. Thank you, Fatima, for joining us here. And I think, I mean, you're asking the $1 million question, right? The $64 million question. It's a very important question. And as Sage said in my introduction, I'm not an expert on the Western Hemisphere, so I'll talk a little bit from a comparative perspective. I'm very interested to hear what Roberta and Emily have to say as the real experts on this issue. From a public policy perspective, which is kind of how I think about it, community engagement and education is really kind of one of the key things that I think is crucial, right? So to the extent that there is disinformation out there, the question is, where does good information, where does quality information come from, and media literacy, and so on and so forth. And I think, as we've seen in the United States from several U.S. states at this U.S. state level initiatives to put in place media literacy education at the high school level, to build in community forums around elections and so on and so forth, where the community itself is freely sharing information that is not controlled by particular media channels, I think is one really crucial element. So I'll put that on the table and turn it over to my colleagues.
I can go next. Fatima, thank you so much for this question. I think it's a really important one. So at ECIS, we often talk about disinformation being a symptom of a larger crisis of trust and also a tool for sowing distrust. And we know that numbers are showing that people are increasingly distrustful of government, of media, and as polarization rises, of each other. And so I wanted to highlight the work of a few organizations in the region. I think civil society and communities have a huge role to play in building trust among communities. And so in particular in Brazil, where I'm originally from, there's an organization called Redes Cordiais, Cordial Networks, and they promote healthy and inclusive dialogue online. And what they're doing is they're bringing together influencers from different communities, people who talk about parenting or who talk about politics or what have you, a variety of different issue areas from different sides of the aisle. They bring them together in person to talk about their responsibility not to be a part of the problem. So how can they be promoting their opinions while also advocating for accuracy-based information? And when they're in the room together, they realize they have a lot more in common than tears them apart. And so I think initiatives like that are really illustrative of the importance of, I think, bringing people together in groups, in communities to get to know each other, get to know each other's work, and share lessons learned and knowledge, and at the same time build trust. So I'll leave that anecdote there for that question.
That's great. Thank you, Naz. Thank you, Roberta. I will add a little bit from the U.S. government perspective. Obviously, the U.S. government is one of many actors in this space, and government is one of many actors in this space. And of course, the State Department is looking at disinformation mostly as a foreign problem because the State Department is funded by Congress to look at foreign relations. And so I really have to defer to people like Roberta when it comes to issues in the U.S. But when it comes to the kinds of work that we do overseas, We have sort of two main prongs, I would say, to our countering disinformation approach, one of which is to try to increase overall community media literacy, that kind of thing. And we can talk more about what that looks like if you like, but the US government does have civil society partners, schools of journalism, journalistic associations, often in addition to other NGOs, in countries that do the really important work of understanding what the local communities need in terms of becoming more resilient to disinformation and misinformation. So that general information literacy piece is one really important part of the picture, and that's usually not an area where the US government is necessarily leading. We are maybe helping to identify great ideas from civil society and to help amplify them. And then in terms of what US government communicators do in the region, I can say, since the original question had to do with tolerance in particular, I think it's important to note that that when you're trying to figure out how to counter disinformation, the normal and best first step is to try to preempt it. Not to directly address it or challenge it, not to engage with people who are trying to sow confusion or sow dissent, that kind of thing. When we use the word disinformation, certainly when I use the word disinformation, I'm referring to wrong information or false information that's not just spread by people who don't understand that it's wrong or false, but by people who are taking things out of context or manipulating information, or sometimes even creating false narratives out of scratch on purpose with the intent of causing harm. And so we don't want to engage people who are bad actors, usually directly, but we do want to spread positive counter messaging in advance, and so if there are issues related to tolerance, for example, with regard to one particular marginalized or underserved community, our US government communicators might try to find really positive examples of ways that people from those communities are contributing to society and ways that the US government is partnering with people from those communities, and try to amplify those enough that they can sort of speak for themselves and preemptively counter the false narratives. I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Fatima, for your great question. And now we turn to questions that we've been receiving from the audience. So I'm just going to field this to all of you. But what can local governments do to address disinformation? What options are available for local government coordination, and what effect would additional coordination have at the national and regional level? Roberta, would you like to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Sage. So I think the best thing that local governments can do to address this information, and this plays off of something that Naz and Emily both touched on, is they can make sure that they are producing fact-based, contextualized information, and that they're putting that out there for their communities in the places where their communities are consuming information. And so not only kind of proactively making sure they're communicating as clearly and as often as possible about things like electoral processes or different policy areas, but that they're also partnering with journalists and community leaders and putting that information not just on their own websites where people might have to dig to find it, but also in the places where we know communities are consuming information. For Latinos in the US, that is primarily on YouTube. And so for us, we're always encouraging people to be talking more on YouTube. I also think that governments can work together to strengthen certain legislation. We never talk about criminalizing disinformation because that is not the way to go. It can be very dangerous. Instead, we talk about legislation that holds social media companies more accountable for promoting transparency about their policies, enforcement, and content moderation, but also legislation that protects our use, the use of our personal and private data. And that really can help, I think, ameliorate the systemic problems that can exacerbate the spread of disinformation.
Thank you, Roberta. Dr. Brama or Emily, would you like to add any comments to that?
Yeah, thank you, Sage. And I think, Roberta set the stage kind of beautifully in terms of the ability of I think the key issue there of local government's real role in providing true information and having kind of the information ecosystem, thinking of it in that way. I loved what Emily said a few minutes ago about the providing kind of misinformation resilience, right? That concept of resilience, I think, is really important. And to me, that includes these sort of issues of literacy and kind of providing factual information that we're talking about. I will just add an example that from the state of Colorado, which is Colorado has a rapid response election security team in place, which was put in place in 2020 by Secretary of State Janet Griswold. And I think it's a really interesting subnational approach to, elections, of course, are, in a federal system like the US and many of the countries that we're talking about. In the context of the City Summit, having the subnational capacity to counter deliberate misinformation and manipulated information is really crucial.
And I'd like to just build on what my colleagues have said, because they've already covered many of the key points already. But I think we can't stress enough that disinformation is a society-wide problem. And so to effectively address it, there really has to be a society-wide approach. And that's not necessarily something that governments are going to lead. Certainly we in the US government like to think that we are leading, and we are in many ways in the US. But again, like I said before, often when we're leading, what we're doing is amplifying great ideas that came up through civil society, from nonprofit partners, in this area of information literacy, from professional journalists and educators. So partnerships are really essential to addressing this. We haven't said a lot yet about the role of educators, but obviously they are essential in building overall information resilience. And so there are lots of civil society organizations, including in the US, they're working with students, as young as elementary school, to make them a little bit more aware of where their information comes from and what they are choosing, I guess, to believe. So the role of educators in this is essential, not only when it comes to journalism schools and things like that. I think I also want to say here that, if you're talking about things at the local level, what local officials can do, I mean, there is the huge cliche of, think globally, act locally, but I really think that it applies almost everywhere. And I say that as someone who's been working in international affairs for more than 20 years. Preserving access to accurate information for citizens is really a cornerstone of this work. And that does include protection of journalists, the physical safety of journalists. It does include promotion of media freedom in general. And so making sure that in their communities, they are having those conversations and making sure that there is space for media, for independent media and fact-based media to operate. That's also super important. And I guess I'll just give one example before I wrap this one up, which is in the state of Colorado. I know that a state legislature introduced not too long ago a bill that would combat the spread of public health disinformation. I don't claim to know much about Colorado politics and whether that bill has any real probability of moving forward, but that is just an example. The amount of disinformation there was and misinformation there was around the COVID-19 pandemic, really brought home for a lot of people, I think, the idea that countering disinformation isn't just about, who do you believe, like the United States or China. I mean, like that might be really important too. The Department of State would certainly say that it is. But, who do you believe when it comes to public health? Do you believe public health officials, or do you believe your neighbors who might not have public health credentials, but who you know to be good, caring citizens, that kind of thing? How do we, restore trust in accurate information and the idea that, science should drive policy decisions? And so that kind of subnational, at least, legislation, those kinds of policy initiatives can, in principle, really make a difference when it comes to, in this case, like saving people's lives, which is definitely, something that government officials everywhere are called on to do.
Sage, could I add one more thing here?
Please do.
The only thing I would add is that, you asked about avenues for collaboration and coordination. I bet the local governments know much more about that than I do. But speaking to the value of it, at ECHIs, we do a lot of narrative analysis and social media listening and monitoring of disinformation narratives. And a lot of what we see, what I will call here master narratives, they recur across borders, not just across states, but across countries. And so there really is a lot of value in different jurisdictions sharing information about what they're seeing circulating in communities, because chances are high that the things that are circulating in one place are also circulating in another. And we know from studies done on psychology and behavior around disinformation that repetition is key for us to process information. And so the more these governments can repeat and repeat and repeat and work together to like amplify and uplift those fact-based messages addressing these common narratives that we see, the better they'll be. Because really when communities are approaching this from like a very individual level, more often than not, they're going to be recreating some wheels, I would say. So, we really can do more to like talk to each other about the things that we're seeing.
That's great, thank you. And it reminds me of, I saw several weeks ago a headline, so I don't know the very nitty gritty details of this, but I think New Jersey just passed a law that is going to require education at all levels to teach kids how to think critically and process information that they receive. So it'd be great to kind of see more legislation like that come up, not only in the United States, but everywhere. So your comments, Emily, made me think of that. Okay, moving on to the next question from our audience. Where does free speech stop and perjury, libel, and slander start? Does free speech work against countering disinformation strategies by protecting disinformation? Naz, would you like to kick this one off?
Sure. This is a really tough question. And what it points to is that there are kind of really important trade-offs, right, that we're kind of grappling with in terms of what our rights are, right? We have a right to the freedom of expression. We also have a right, and I think this is something that has been sort of increasingly promoted in the context of international norms at bodies like the United Nations, and I'd be interested to hear if my colleagues sort of know of other initiatives. We have the right to reliable information, right? And these two things might actually they don't always come together, right? They act at cross purposes to each other. And so thinking about, the right to reliable information as a right, I think is worth kind of thinking about, and the role that international organizations play in shaping the normative environment in which countries kind of have these conversations with each other that then sort of cascade down. I think this is sort of both up and down the levels of governance. The other thing I'll point to, and I was, as I mentioned, I'm not an expert on the Western Hemisphere, but I have been very interested in looking at democratic erosions in the BRICS, right? In Brazil, Russia, India, and Turkey. I would add Turkey to that mix. And both India and Turkey in the last 6 months or so have passed election information laws, right, that sort of give the government the right to censor information and to say that people who are seen as obvious purveyors of misinformation can be prosecuted under these laws, and you could see that as a potential salvo in this fight against misinformation. You could also see it as a form of authoritarian leaning governments controlling information, right? And so this is a very delicate balance that we have to. It's very difficult to get right. And the law in this case, I think, is a very blunt instrument. So I'll, again, put that on the table and turn to my colleagues to hear more.
I can build on Naz's point, Sage. So this is like the question of the century, and a lot of courts are grappling with it right now, including our own Supreme Court here in the US. The one thing is, so lies themselves have in the past been dealt with through defamation law. But one of the biggest challenges when it comes to disinformation in online spaces is not only, measuring its spread and impact, but also determining the intent to deceive. So did a person mean to deceive when they posted something, or did they just not realize that what they posted was incorrect or misleading? Where did a false claim even start? Who amplified it, when, and why? Like, all of these questions are required legally to prove some of these like intent cases, and they're really, really difficult to do online. So the only thing I would add there is to like hate speech, which is slightly different than outright disinformation, isn't defined in the First Amendment here in the US at least. And so I think there are a lot of, we've thought about in the past, like, oh, could it make sense to modernize libel and slander laws? But I think it goes back to my point earlier of like, lawyers still have to prove certain things, and doing so online is really, really tough. So I don't think we're quite there yet.
I'll just add a tiny bit here, I guess. I am not a constitutional lawyer. I mean, for Americans, when we talk about freedom of speech, we're talking about the First Amendment. And so I won't define what the First Amendment is. I mean, like as a US citizen, my understanding is that it means that the US government can't take away an individual's right to self-expression. But what freedom of speech isn't, you know, freedom of speech doesn't mean that like private companies, for example, can't do what they want. Freedom of speech doesn't mean that you have a platform, that you have some entitlement to a platform. I think for people of my generation, like it's easy to think back to when public discourse was mostly on the editorial page of newspapers. Anyone can write a letter to the news, you know, and a letter to the editor of a newspaper. Like you can write a letter every single day, you know, about one topic or about a range of topics, but you just shouldn't expect it to get published that often, you know, like there is no guarantee of a platform. And then of course, also freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences either. So what you have now, obviously, is a globalized information environment in which people like us have access to a much broader platform or much broader audiences than we ever would have before the spread of the internet and social media. At the same time, that means that our ideas, you know, might be exposed to a much broader range and a much bigger number of people. And so, like, if people say something controversial on purpose to attract attention, for example, they shouldn't be surprised when they do attract attention and controversy, because we have a much broader audience than we've ever had before. And we also have many more directions from which we can take on pressure, I guess. And so, yeah, freedom of speech is a super interesting question. But yeah, I feel like the longstanding precedents with regard to not being able to incite violence, not being able to yell fire in a crowded theater, I guess is the original legal precedent for that. The fact that we do have some protected speech that might include offensive speech that just isn't violent. I mean, like as I think Roberta said, like courts in many places are still chewing on, how this does and doesn't apply in the modern era. But I think it's as important to remember what free speech isn't as to remember what it is. Thanks.
Great, thank you all. Emily, Spanish is the second most spoken language in the United States. Can you elaborate on what work is being done to counter disinformation in Spanish within the US and the Western Hemisphere more broadly?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, although I'll mostly be talking about what the US government does outside of the US, since that's the State Department's area. And I think that Roberta is probably really well positioned to talk about the Spanish language media landscape inside the United States. But obviously we have US embassies, we have diplomats, we have public diplomacy officers and cultural affairs officers, information officers, in nearly every country in the hemisphere. And so we have teams of diplomats who are working hand in hand with their locally employed staff colleagues who are the real experts on the local media landscape and culture. And we work with them to put out messages as the US government. So we do try to amplify US policy priorities wherever we can. US policy priorities, might include things that you would see on the front page of a newspaper, but US policy priorities always also include things like tolerance, diversity, information literacy. Like the US policies are not drawn exclusively from the headlines. And so we do have those folks who are working on messaging type operations. Often, like I said before, this is in partnership with educators, with media partners, with other civil society actors. And then we do also usually have a wide range of programs that are run out of US embassies, some of which are by my public diplomacy colleagues, but many of which are actually run by representatives of other US government agencies, especially the US Agency for International Development. USAID is trying to do a lot in the Western Hemisphere to protect journalists and to promote media freedom in general. Not all of those efforts are appropriate to be discussed, of course, in detail in an open setting, but the US government does know that sometimes journalists are in danger of their lives because of spreading accurate information, especially if it's about something like corruption. And so the US government does have some programs in place with civil society organizations to try to ensure the physical safety of journalists who might find themselves, facing death threats and suddenly needing to leave the country, something like that. USAID's programs with media organizations also include things, efforts. There's an effort in partnership with Microsoft, for example, to help media organizations to understand a little bit better how they can be profitable without sacrificing their journalistic integrity. Because one thing that we've seen, I think in the US and everywhere in the world, I did serve in Norway for 2 years, for example, and in Norway, the average citizen still reads something like 2 newspapers a day. I mean, it's a very information-rich environment. But even in Norway, newsrooms have been shrinking over the last couple of decades. And so there aren't as many people who can dig as deeply into as many stories, and there's a lot more infotainment, there's a lot more one thing that we see at the State Department as a result of that is news outlets, local news outlets that are more willing to accept content that's produced by foreign news organizations. And so we do try to help keep independent journalism as sustainable an industry as possible. So both on the programming side and the information side, I would say, the US embassies in the region, meaning the US interagency, not just the State Department, is trying to engage, basically on as many fronts as possible. Also, of course, our colleagues in the political section would be talking to host government officials about making sure that they're not, imprisoning journalists, that kind of thing. My most recent assignment was actually in Kyrgyzstan, which is definitely not a very open media environment, although Kyrgyzstan is a democracy and does enjoy a fair amount of fact-based journalism compared to other countries in Central Asia. And for us, it was a very high priority.
Thanks, Emily.
Roberta, do you want to talk some more about the Western Hemisphere, or about Spanish-speaking communities in the US in particular?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for this question. This is my department's mandate at ECIS. We are working to counter disinformation affecting Latinos in the US. So I'll talk a little about our work in a little bit, but I did want to highlight 3 different, I would say, groups of efforts that are working to counter Spanish language disinfo. The first is many organizations in the US and in the region, but in the US, are working to get ahead of the narrative. We've talked a lot about that. So I would say election administrators like Secretary of State Griswold in Colorado and in other states are kind of actively trying to get ahead of disinformation by putting out great explainer content, by making that content available in different languages in Spanish, engaging more with Spanish-speaking communities in their states. So I think that proactive pre-bunking work is growing. We also have a lot of local news stations, local journalists working in Spanish to also try to get ahead of some of that. So I think the pre-bunking is one area. The other area is what we call debunking. So some organizations, especially fact checkers in the United States, are working to verify content that's false in real time. So Fact Chequeado here in the United States is a relatively new fact-checking organization, but it was co-founded by a couple of women who had previously co-founded fact-checking organizations in the region. And they are doing really wonderful work fact-checking in Spanish here in the United States. And that's valuable because people, at least when they Google content, those links, those explainers are some of the things they'll come across. So that's great. And then I would say the third kind of group or approach are the people that are working to address some of the systemic pitfalls. So 3 factors that really exacerbate the spread of Spanish language disinformation in the US. The first is big information voids in reputable Spanish language news and information. There are one or two traditional news outlets that report in Spanish, but otherwise a lot of Latinos in the US are getting their information from infotainers, I would say, as was mentioned previously, or content creators in spaces where they consume information that are not journalists by training. And so that information is coded in like opinion, it's coded in their own perspectives, right? So not exactly always the most reputable. The second factor is that a lot of bad actors are trying to pit communities against each other. So they're really taking advantage of like generational and cultural nuances in Latino communities in the US. And so groups of people, including a few coalitions that I'm a part of, are working to both make sure that social media companies are investing more in Spanish language content moderation and acting on it in the US setting. But they're also advocating for regulation, including at the Federal Trade Commission level, consumer protections, things like that, that would make the information environment more safe for Latino communities. And then at ECIS, we do a combo of public opinion research and narrative analysis. And what we really want to understand is, to what extent are Latinos coming across and believing disinformation? And a lot of what we do is countering stereotypes. I think people still look at Latino communities and they may say, well, Latinos are more vulnerable or they're more susceptible. And sure, the factors I mentioned may make this a problem unique in some spaces to our communities, but there is nothing about our communities that makes us gullible. And in fact, our research has shown that it's not low information voters that are believing and seeing this information. It's the more politically partisan that come across it more and believe it more. So part of our work is also making sure that people are working with our communities and not kind of fetishizing disinformation's impact on Latinos and things like that. So very long answer to your question, but
Sage, is it okay if I come in on this too? I'm just really grateful for the really rich detail that you're both providing, and I'm afraid I'm only limited to a couple of more general insights, but I wanted to just pick up on a couple of issues that you both are pointing to. One is that journalists are absolutely on the front lines of this fight, right? And there's Maria Ressa, the Filipina journalist, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 for her work in combating misinformation, among many other things, in the Philippines political context, as well as more broadly. We had the honor of her being at our Denver Democracy Summit in 2020, which was wonderful, where she spoke about this topic. The other thing I wanted to just pick up on is, the point, I think, just echoing what you just said, Roberta, that this is a problem writ large, right? And the not to fetishize the particular communities per se, that this fractured, partisan, unreliable information environment that we exist in is a fact for everyone. And I was thinking a couple of weeks ago, Jamel Bowie had this really wonderful op-ed in the New York Times. He's a regular columnist there, where he talked about actually this fractured environment, the media environment has actually been the norm in American political life. If you go all the way back to, he's a historian of American political culture and life. If you go back to the Revolution and the Civil War and so on, fractured information and polarized echo chambers was actually the norm. And so we think back to the post-World War II, there were 30 years where it was the 3 broadcast networks that were the news that everybody had in the US. That's actually the exception. But what Bowie was pointing out, and I think this is, it amplifies what both of you have said, is that the difference now in the last couple of decades, is basically the utter decimation of local media, local level, kind of community level media, where people just don't have the access to the every town and city in the US had a local newspaper that people read as a community. You made the point about Emily, about people reading 2 newspapers in Norway. When people are reading the same news, it forms a political community. And the ways in which our lack of media and our lack of shared media and information deteriorates our sort of civic fabric, and then builds on the mistrust that we've been talking about, is really a crucial piece of this for me. And I see that in the United States. I don't know how that plays out as much in other countries in the Western Hemisphere.
Great, thank you all for those very, very detailed and interesting responses. Moving on, information and disinformation can be seen as completely relative to the propagandist. Might it be more effective to shine a light on or disclose the source of the information and then allow people to make their own decisions? How do we increase transparency of those publishers in print and online on social media? If anyone would like to jump right in with this one, please feel free. Emily, do you have any comments on it?
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a stab. I mean, I do want to, I guess, talk a tiny bit about terminology, not to be super academic, but this isn't an academic environment, so I will just do a brief detour. So we use the term, or I use the term disinformation sort of broadly as a catch-all. Like I have disinformation in my working title, like I'm a senior advisor for countering disinformation, but disinformation is just a single word that doesn't capture a whole lot of nuance, obviously. And so, I mean, there has been a lot of discussion in the last year or two, especially about how disinformation in some ways is in the eye of the beholder. And there are organizations that have been engaged in this space for quite some time that have moved away from the term disinformation because disinformation is a label, it's subject to debate. I mean, that doesn't mean that there aren't, you know, some truths to be had, of course, but you know, so for example, some of our colleagues from the European Union, they might use a term more like information manipulation and influence, which is a slightly more neutral term. And there is a lot of work that's been done in the research community and the academic community to try to get better at identifying disinformation and how it spreads, that kind of thing. And so there are a number of not-for-profit organizations, sometimes funded with federal grants, working on analytics, that kind of thing. And so I will say that I think that a lot of the work that's being done right now, sort of on the cutting edge of understanding disinformation, is not using that term necessarily. They're really just looking at ways to I guess, look at the media environment and identify narratives that are trending and narratives that are trending disproportionately or having, you know, disproportionate influence, you know, narratives that are suddenly being echoed across multiple platforms in a way that, you know, suggests that they're coordinated, that kind of thing. And so that is just data then that can be used for any purpose by any actor, which means, of course, that it, you know, if it's really publicly spread, that it could help disinformation actors to just get, you know, more subtle and more sneaky in their methods, you know. But yes, I do recognize that the word disinformation does, you know, that it is a label, and there are other ways that we can frame it. Disinformation for me at the State Department, since I come at everything through the prism of international relations, like for me, disinformation is just one type of foreign malign influence, which is another term that like some people are still using and other people think is outdated. But, you know, obviously, like if we're concerned about false information being spread widely from official Chinese media about human rights abuses in Xinjiang, for example. I mean, like that's one form of Chinese PRC malign influence, but another form of PRC malign influence would be what sometimes people call debt trap diplomacy, you know, like issuing loans to build poor quality infrastructure projects that, you know, when they come due are going to mean that countries either go bankrupt or suddenly are beholden to China in ways that they didn't initially anticipate. So I continue to look at this partly through the prism of geopolitics, but my colleagues might want to talk a little bit more about, you know, what this means to them. Thanks.
So I'm really glad Emily went straight to the terminology. That was what I was doing, what I was going to do too. I think that's honestly the first step is, so at ECIS, we are very carefully defining disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. And I think for anyone engaging with information, it's important to differentiate, know the difference, and to be able to somewhat identify what the three different things are. Disinformation, Emily mentioned, is like false information with intent to deceive, where you can decipher what the intent is. Misinformation, false information where you might not be able to decipher the intent. And propaganda is usually deliberate spread of information to influence a group or an institution, what have you. I think the biggest challenge nowadays is that a lot of times that is a lot harder to distinguish. A lot of actors are taking a grain of truth and really like twisting that. And so not everything that you see is outright false, but it's also not accurate and not contextualized. So I still think important to try to differentiate between the three things. And then to your point, Sage, about the messenger or the labeling of content. So I think that's a huge component of what media literacy teaches you. So one of the first things that anyone who's engaging with information should think of is like, where did this come from? Who's spreading it? And like, who's paying for it, if anyone? And there are some really easy ways to figure that out. And so, even a basic couple of Google searches, or taking a look at labels on social media accounts, just going into the about page of a social media account, that can give you a clearer picture. And sometimes you'll see, for example, Facebook accounts or groups, they will have been created in a specific country, but the managers of that group are based in another country. And the website leads you to a third country, and you start to wonder, well, that's odd, right? So I think that it's almost on us to also be able to just take a moment to check if we can determine like who is spreading the information, and think a little bit critically about what that might mean.
Can I do the academic thing and ask my panelists a question? Is that okay? My co-panelists, I'm really fascinated by this. And what it's making me think of is that sort of, what the regulatory side of this is or could be, right? So kind of in the financial system, when there's a clear kind of coordinated algorithmic response to something affecting the stock market, there's a circuit breaker that shuts the stock market down, right? Are there measures like that in terms of sort of how quickly or sort of how much something is going viral, that are indicators that there are these cycles of misinformation or propaganda happening, that are signals to people in your world that this needs to be looked at. This is something we've got to look into from a public good perspective. I'm just really curious to know what you might have to say to that.
So Naz, from our perspective, I would point people to Ben Nimmo's scale of virality. I don't know if that's the exact name, but he outlined a series of things that you can look for to determine whether a piece of content is worth responding to or acting against. So steps like cross-platform pollination, like is this something that you're seeing in a variety of places, or is it pretty exclusive to, say, like a more fringe website? Has mainstream media picked this up? Like, if so, then it's probably impacting more communities. Are people in different countries talking about it? So look up Ben Nimmo's work, because he is one of the entrepreneurs of this field. I had the honor of working with him very briefly when I was at the Atlantic Council. And he, I think, coined a lot of these scales to try to land a measurement of these things a little bit. So I will say that there are other things we look at too, but I won't go too long.
Yeah, that's super important. Thank you, Roberta, for flagging his work. That's all. I mean, that's definitely a cornerstone of our understanding of how and when it is important to engage disinformation. I mean, I'll just say, the role of the U.S. government here again is fairly limited because of freedom of speech. I mean, we're not going to shut something down, actively. The freedom of speech controversies are usually resolved through the court system very slowly, But I mean, we do talk to social media companies, for example. They have their own teams working on these issues, and they do have their own policies, and we do try to, help them understand what we see the problem is, at times, especially what Roberta flagged about, languages, that's huge. I mean, especially for niche languages, my last post was in Kyrgyzstan, there is a lot of Kyrgyz language social media content. Who do you think is monitoring it? Basically no one. And I mean, that's a resource question for them that they have to figure out, but for us to be able to go to Facebook and say, hey, if there are elections coming up and there's a lot of disinformation, are we going to is there someone at Facebook who's watching? Is there someone at Facebook who might say, oh, there is dangerous information trending that, we should, seek to make lower visibility in our algorithms, that kind of thing. Not a lot of visibility into that. Again, it's roles and responsibilities, but we do try to have constructive partnerships with private industry, as well as all of the other private sector actors that I've talked about.
Sorry, having a hard time unmuting. Thanks, Naz, for that question. That was great. So we are unfortunately running out of time, but I do want to ask quickly, Emily, what is the City Summit of the Americas? What are the intended outcomes of the summit? Who will be in attendance? And how will the topic of disinformation be featured during the summit?
Sure, I can talk to that briefly. Roberta and Eki's Institute are also involved in making sure that countering disinformation is on the agenda for the City Summit. So yeah, the City Summit, obviously, it's coming up later this month in Denver. And it has, I think, over 3,100 registered participants from municipalities throughout the region, from subnational governments, so mayors, obviously, other municipal officials. Also, we have a lot of state level officials from the US who will be coming, as well as a lot of civil society leaders. So making sure that community level actors are aware of ways that society-wide and economy-wide, global type issues, how they affect them in their communities, and also, more importantly, I think really like what they can do about them. So yeah, the City Summit will be 2+ jam-packed days of interaction. Almost all of the events at the summit are organized by civil society partners, but with Eki's Institute and Arizona State's Cronkite School of Journalism, the State Department is sponsoring one conversation on countering disinformation that will feature government leaders from the United States and from the United States and other countries in the region, all at the subnational level, as well as some of their civil society counterparts. And hopefully we'll again talk about what people can do at the local community level. And I do have a couple of ideas about that I'll be happy to maybe drop into the chat for follow-up Googling if people are curious, if we don't get to them during the conversation today. I hope that answers your question. I think that we'll talk a little bit more about youth opportunities to get involved as we're wrapping up.
Yeah, that's great. Roberta, do you want to add anything else to that point?
No, Eki's is super excited to be working with Emily and her team on this. It's a continuation of a conversation that we started at the Summit of the Americas in LA last year. And so it was just really great to kind of be bringing together subnational leaders. That's such an important, I feel like I studied public diplomacy. I remember talking a lot about subnational level diplomacy, and I'm really glad that it's getting the attention it deserves at the summit this year. So join us. It's Friday, April 28th at 9 a.m. And hopefully we'll get a chance to meet some of you in person there.
Great, thank you. Well, we have about 6 minutes left, but I just want to thank our audience for their great questions. And I want to turn to our panelists quickly to share any final thoughts if you'd like to share anything. Emily, if you'd like to begin, please feel free.
Sure, I'll go very quickly. I recognize that when there was a question about what we're doing in the region, and especially with Spanish language, I sort of went into detail about what U.S. embassies overseas are doing, but that's always because I'm excited to talk to students and want to highlight the possibility of careers in diplomacy. So I'm from North Carolina. I made my way into the policy world sort of slowly, and have found international relations to be an endlessly fascinating and immensely rewarding career. So think about it. In addition to that, yeah, I'll drop in the chat before we hang up a couple of things, educational tools that are available for students in their communities, that kind of thing. There are some online video games that are not intended to compete with, Minecraft and the like, but are educational tools that help, anyone from any walk of life to understand why it's important to be more aware of where your information comes from and what you choose to spread. So there are those resources. There's also the Digital Communication Network, which did recently start its America's Hub, and that's a great way for people who are interested in connecting with like-minded, communicators, mostly independent of governments. That's a worldwide network of people sharing best practices, and so I would recommend it highly, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. Just echoing thanks for the excellent questions, and to my fellow panelists for their expertise.
Great, thank you, Emily. Naz, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with everyone?
Thank you all so much, and thanks, Sage, for doing a terrific job moderating here. I will echo Emily's encouragement to anybody who's considering a career in international affairs, international relations. And I think, the conversation that we've had here, and as Roberta was just saying, the role of the city and of the subnational unit in global diplomacy is only increasing, right? I mean, in the kind of networked world that we live in, what the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy, which I direct, is trying to do is kind of articulate how, Denver is a global city, and kind of other sister cities at places that we're partnering with, other universities, how students can kind of think of these levels of governance as completely interrelated in a really interesting and rich way. So I would just echo that as well. Thank you, Emily and Roberta. I've learned a ton today. I have a bunch of new research ideas. I know that wasn't the point, but that's where I've ended up. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Naz. And finally, Roberta, do you have any final words for our audience?
Sure. No, so thank you, echoing everyone's thank you. This was so much fun. It's such a pleasure to be here. I love talking to students. Reach out anytime. I mean, putting myself out there as a resource if anyone wants to talk about career paths. Very much echoing what Emily said. My background, I also studied international relations and communications. And the only thing I would say is there are just so many interesting ways that you can contribute to creating a healthier internet, a healthier information environment. I worked for a long time in the private sector, and then for a long time in the think tank world. And don't tell my former colleagues this, but when I applied to the think tank, I didn't even know what a think tank was or what they did. So just, you don't know what you don't know is out there. And there are like very many exciting opportunities to combine international relations and communications. And so I really encourage you to get involved and to come to the City Summit to hear more about this.
Great, thank you, Roberta. Well, thank you so much to our panelists for your time and comments. And thank you to our audience this afternoon for your participation. I believe we've had a wonderfully interesting and insightful conversation. And thank you for attending the Disinformation and Democracy session of the City Summit of the Americas University Office Hours series. The Corbell School, in partnership with the U.S. Department of State, will host one final session to round out this education series on April 20th from 12 to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. This final session will feature the Mayor of Denver, Michael Hancock, and Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Brian Nichols. We look forward to their discussion on how young people can get involved in local government and opportunities for engagement at the City Summit of the Americas. I hope you'll join us on April 20th. And as a final reminder, the City Summit of the Americas for Youth is still accepting applications. We encourage all qualifying youth and young professionals to apply at the City Summit of the Americas website. You'll also find more information about the University Office Hours series under the Youth tab. Thank you for your attendance and participation. We hope to see you at our final Office Hours event on the 20th. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.